right. Well, welcome everyone today to our Truett Church Network webinar and podcast. This is the fourth of our Advent conversations we are having in this Advent season for those preparing to preach and teach and live the themes of Advent this winter. I think winter maybe starts this week. So wherever we happen to find ourselves. Of course, in Texas, it was 85, 89 degrees last week, and then 35 Sunday morning. And so you just never know what it feels like. But our guest is Dr. Andy Arterbury, known to many of you, loved by a few of you. That's right. But professor of Christian scriptures at Truett Seminary. And we're really grateful, Andy, that you could be here today.
Sure, absolutely.
How long have you been at Truett, Andy?
You know, I started at Truett in 2007. So I've been here, what is that, 13, 14 years, something?
A while. A good vague term, a while. Yeah. Covers a lot of ground. But well, we have visited with Jack Bodenhammer about hope, with Steve Reed about peace, and Angela Gorell last week about joy. And we're here. We've lit the pink candle now, and we're on to our final purple candle of Advent and love. And we just appreciate you being here and visiting with us.
Well, I'm the JV team in that collection of people, but I'm glad to be with you.
Well, you know, these are not specifically to promote Truett, but we can promote Truett. Truett's got a pretty deep bench for the A team. I mean, you know, we can go pretty deep at Truett with a lot of wonderful people that can discuss in great depth some fun things. Yeah. And that's one of the beauty of being a part of the Truett family, for sure. Well, we're here to talk about love. So when we think about love, just starting out our conversation, as you think biblically as a New Testament scholar, what's the biblical witness of love? How would you start talking about that?
Well, I certainly would differentiate the biblical witness from kind of the broader culture, and I'm not trying to reduce the broader cultural view, but often in our culture, we think primarily about emotions, and we may well add in actions, but it begins with emotions. I think the biblical witness is beginning with action, and it often includes, and I would say always includes emotion, but what's leading out is action. You know, it as simple as John 15:13, greater love hath no man than this, or no person than this, that person lays down his or her life for her friends. I mean, it's not just action, but it's, I would say, sacrificial action. The psalm I was kind of living with all of last week was Psalm 107. It's a psalm of thanksgiving, but you know what it does is it's probably you know, at least Dr. Tucker's commentary tells me that it's written in light of the return from the exile.
Yeah.
But it's really testimony. It's just it reminds me of our church where we used to do testimony night, but it starts with, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever." It's really that hesed of God, that covenant faithfulness of God, and it just chronicles. It has 6 different calls to give thanks for God's steadfast love. It just keeps calling. It'll remember walking through wilderness and being thirsty and hungry, and yet God provides. And so let's give thanks for his steadfast love. And then it recalls our sinfulness and our need for healing, and God delivers, and let's give thanks for his steadfast love. And then it moves on to sea storms and dangerous travel. It moves on to the need for rain for crops to grow and animals to multiply, the lowly needing to be lifted up, and the oppressors turned over. But it just keeps returning to that refrain 6 times to give thanks for the steadfast love of the Lord. And so if I'm really thinking about the biblical witness, it's that it's first and foremost the action. There's no doubt that God has a fondness for us, but it's action based and sacrificial in that.
So when you say action, you're meaning God's action toward creation and toward us, that it is not just a state of being that God is love, but that love is active and shown, directed toward us.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely. Yeah, you
You
put it
can
much
even
better
go
than
back
I
to
did.
creation, that
Yep.
creation itself is an act of love that does not add anything to
Yes.
God, because God is love. That's what I thought a lot about in just thinking through this, of that God is love. I mean, that this is the essence of God as God issues forth toward us in so many different ways.
Yeah.
So if those things are true, if God is love, if the essence of the witness of love is God's, every bit perhaps of God's action toward us, then why is love such a challenge to receive it, I guess, to give it, to live in light of that? What's the challenge of love?
Well, perhaps if I was to phrase it, the most challenging thing about love for us compared to God, I think it's the longevity in God's love. I just finished a semester of Scriptures 3, which is the Gospels and Acts, and we always end with John, and in particular this year, but it just really struck me that we for Christmas we often look at Matthew and Luke and the birth narratives, but there at the beginning of John with that prologue, verses 1 through 18, you talked about creation. John 1:1 starts by reminding you of God's love in creation, and the preexistence of the Word or God's Spirit. But I guess it just made me think about John 1:1 as a Christmas story. I'm sure many who are listening have preached John 1 at Christmas time, but we don't often think about it. But it's really that canonical story that God's love pre-existed even before creation. God's love acknowledges that darkness in the fall came. And then I think it's that reaction of how has God responded. For many of us, we may have love that's not just emotion, that's action, and it may even be sacrificial action, but it's how long do you sustain that? When somebody betrays you, somebody lets you down, at some point you're tempted to give up. And then that whole witness of Scripture is God providing covenant after covenant. But then instead of saying, I'm giving up or I'm going in a different direction, John 1:1 says the great miracle is that God chose to come closer. That his sacrificial love is not to stay far away or find a new people to start over. It's let me come even closer and tabernacle among you. So for me, that's the real challenge of love for us is the longevity. Can we continue to make sacrificial love decisions?
Which is both this is one thing we've talked about almost every week. It's come up that these themes are both gifts of the Spirit, right? They have to be given by God and received by God. Joy in all circumstances, hope in the face of despair, peace in the midst of conflict and turmoil and everything else, love in the face of so many reasons not to love. So we receive, and yet we have agency. We're called to be agents of these things in the world and living in that tension. So, man, longevity, I'm going to have to think more about that. That's really good. And I think, right, if we say that, we also have to talk about abundance in longevity, that it's not just doled out in measured amounts of love so that it lasts forever. But it is an abundance. It is prodigal, to use a good biblical word. It's wildly inefficient in some ways. I think Dallas Willard talked about we burn in talking about grace, which is to talk, which is in the love realm, right? We burn it like jet fuel all day long, and that's just, that phrase has stuck with me for a long time of how we use this. Love over longevity. That's good. So when you think of a story of love, I mean, a lot of places we can go here, but for those preaching and teaching, particularly, and thinking about applying this, I mean, what's a story that comes to mind of a story of this love we're talking about?
Well, this is something else that's been really on my heart the last week, and yeah, I guess it's a story, but it's not like a typical story in that it has a beginning, middle, and end. I was in seminary, and I had we had a Bible study, a group of four of us, and we've stayed together as a covenant group even after that. And so one of the guys in the covenant groups, one of my very best friends, he's a pastor, and he and his wife had a baby maybe 6 months before we did, um, and it took about year one before they started asking some hard questions, and then by year two you realize something's not quite right.
Yeah.
And then at least by year three, it was pretty clear this is a special needs child.
Yeah.
They've taken him to a variety of specialists, and they can't really categorize him. He's kind of a one of a kind, so that they don't have a label, which aren't very helpful anyway.
Yeah.
But I guess he would be closest to autism, though it's not autism.
Yeah.
He can't communicate. Now he can figure out language, but he can't communicate. So he's never once in his life, he's now 27 years old, he's never said I love you to his parents.
Yeah.
And you can't have that kind of interaction. He'll never be able to take care of himself. But what's fascinating to me is just walking alongside my friend and his wife.
Yeah.
They never once, I mean, and I mean, 27 years, I've never heard them once talk about their son without saying, he brings joy to our life. And yet what I see is over and over again, these sacrificial decisions, opportunities, or at least churches ask, would you come serve with us, or that, and they say no so that they can keep their son in a good situation. They had a really nice house within a mile of the church.
Yeah.
Their son on more than one occasion ends up out in the street without clothes on and singing Christmas carols even in July. And the neighbors are worried. They call the police. The police don't know how to respond to him. He's a big guy. And so after 2 or 3 dangerous encounters, they finally moved 45 minutes out into the country, and he can go out on the gravel road, and nobody worries. And
Yeah.
But I guess what I'm talking about there is that seems to me to be one of the closest examples I've seen of that steadfast love that's akin to the Lord's love. It's action, it's sacrificial, but it is longevity. It's an unending story of love. And to me, I guess that's the one that just keeps coming to my mind the last couple of weeks is, boy, Lord, let me have that kind of love. That there's no end in sight, but it's just ongoing.
Yeah. That blank check written is committed. Which I don't want to draw. I'm not drawing a direct parallel between that and the church, but that is when church is at its best.
Yes.
It's that sort of covenantal love that we may not choose to hang out with, our brothers and sisters in Christ. These may not be the people that we would choose necessarily to have in our community. It's not a country club, but it's people with faults. It's people that annoy us, that we may not like. I mean, we go on and on, right? We go down that road a ways. Yet it's the love of God, of a crucified God at that. I mean, I think love finds its fulfillment in you have to talk about a crucified God if you're talking about love of God, obviously. That we covenant to be together and to be for one another. And boy, I know as a pastor that got me through a lot of days of folks saying, man, I kind of wish I had some more. I think Peterson calls them spiritual green berets. He said he started a new church and he thought it'd be full of these spiritual green berets. And he said he pretty much just got the dregs. But he said that's about the best we can ever say in church is we are table waiters to the dregs that covenant to be together. And that's about as high as pastors rise. It's table waiters.
Yeah.
Anyway,
That's good.
so we'll have folks on here preaching and teaching this week. We'll have others that are just striving to live this, or maybe struggling to live this love this week, or to embrace it, to receive it, to give it. If you had a final encouragement, Andy, what might that be?
Well, there's no doubt a lot of things have stressed ministers and the church, whether it's COVID or the political context. And as you said, I think at almost every turn, and every congregation, every minister I've talked to, there's the risk that we could be torn apart, that love ends, that we decide to go different ways. And I think that the answer is back there with Psalm 107, is that we periodically, we simply need to sit down and think back through all the other crises we've faced, all the other stress, all the other times where we would have given up, and yet God has stayed faithful over and over and over again. And so I think my encouragement is for you and your congregation to spend time thinking about how God has been good. And hopefully in the midst of that steadfast love of God, perhaps it instructs us, inspires us to hang in there longer, that allow the grace of God to have some expression in our own sacrificial, long, at least steadfast love that we couldn't come up with on our own. To me, that, as you pointed out to begin with, Matt, that's found in the grace of God that we ever do that. So,
boy, and that's very, Deuteronomic, I guess, of Moses on the edge of the promised land, say, let's tell this story again. Let's remember how God has brought us thus far. That when one of my former staff members from my pastorate came through town a couple years ago and spent a couple days with us. And I think she was at a Truett conference, actually, children's ministry conference here at Truett. And, we had a lot of wonderful times, a lot of hard times in our church. We had a lot of people leave, difficulty that any church has, particularly a brand new church, that caused its, scarring that happens from time to time. Every minister, every person holds some of those scars. And then, but about 4 years removed from that, when we told the stories again, we just wept together that night, because when we look back on it, we rubbed those scars a little fondly, but the story we look back on was unmitigated blessing and love. I mean, even some of those folks that are hard to be around, even some of the hard times, we had lived long enough to know the blessing on the other side of that. And it is funny perception sometimes. Often when we look back, not always, there's a lot of things that aren't lovely, and it's a lot harder to. But often, the story looking back, and this is maybe a word for us today, maybe even looking back on COVID one day, there may be some very loving things we think about of how we cared for one another, about, of some of the good that has been in this time that is so hard to see if we're not naming it actively and we're in the midst of conflict. But boy, that longevity of love is man, there's a lot of hope there, and a lot of challenge for us.
You remind me when Dr. Angela Reed was being hired at Truett, in her interview, one of the things she talked about in kind of the Baptistic free church tradition, she said that testimony is one of our sacraments, really, in the Baptist tradition, that or at least the free church tradition, that it's one of the things, it's one of our forms of spirituality that is most distinctive to us, is recall, sit back and tell the stories, give testimony.
Boy, that may be an encouragement. I think that is, of getting back to some of those things. Well, Andy, thank you for your time. Despite my joke at the beginning, which was in poor form, you are well loved at Truett, and you've been a great encouragement to me as a fellow staff member and colleague here. And I'm thankful, in a very busy week with grades about due, finals, and everything else, that you took some time to be with us today and encourage. You're a great friend to many pastors and ministers. And thank you for being here today. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I love being with you. So.
All right. Y'all have a wonderful rest of the Advent and beginning of Christmas season. Thank you for tuning in. Have a great day. Bye-bye.